Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner. If you like the show, please rate and review it on the platforms wherever you listen to podcasts, particularly on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find us and grow the show. And of course, you can learn more about Flute New Music Consortium at flutenewmusicconsortium.com. Seattle-based composer and pianist Kari Cruver Medina has worked as a music director, studio musician, and Emmy-nominated composer for film and television. Her award-winning music includes compositions spanning a broad swath of stylistic traditions, including art song, solo and chamber works, as well as choral, band, and orchestral compositions. Medina's music has been performed and premiered across the country and internationally. Born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, Kari grew up on the Puget Sound. She then attended the University of Washington in composition and piano performance. There, she met her husband, brain scientist and author John Medina. The two attended graduate school together at Washington State University, where Kari completed her master's degree with Dr. Lauren Olson. Settling in Seattle, she worked for years as the music director for a large Presbyterian church, then spent a decade raising two sons who are now in college. It was when the youngest graduated from high school in 2018 that she returned to composing full-time. We were lucky enough to initially learn about Kari through her duet, The Cabinet of Curiosities, which won FNMC's 2024 composition competition in the flute chamber music category. Kari, welcome to Music Crush. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to meet you both.
I really appreciated the mention of your family life in your bio, because that's the reality for most artists. You don't get to luxuriate in creative work every day. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about how you came to the decisions that you did and the particular challenges that you faced as both a person who trained for a career and a person who wanted a family?
Sure. That's a huge question. And it's so relevant, especially for us as women now. It's strange to think that we represent the first generation really that can control the number of kids we have. I mean, that's weird to think about in my lifetime. And that we have musically the opportunity to seek a professional career. I mean, that's a weird thought too. I worked with a vocalist whose grandmother moved to this country, got married. She wanted to be an opera star, but when she got married, she was not allowed at the turn of the century as a married woman to perform. It was considered uncouth. So you have this whole musical tradition where women are trained. It's a part of, at least in the Western tradition, it's a part of your educational experience, right? You think of Jane Eyre and some of those great Victorian novels where women are learning instruments, learning to play in a demure way, of course. And yet it was never available to them professionally. That would have been considered uncouth. So I think it's interesting to be at this point in time. I feel very, very lucky. But I also know that from a practical perspective, it's a tough career to balance. I mean, any career is tough to balance as a mom. I would say I want to respect all careers because everybody puts their work into it. But music is particularly unpredictable and project-based if you're a composer. And that kind of intense project-based focused is also what raising children is like. And so your question is good because it's where those two converge. And I think I've had to learn that this career that I have chosen, and I'd say more it's chosen me. I've got to admit that from the time I was a little kid, I felt like this is who I am. This is how I communicate to the world, is through music. I felt called as a composer, as someone who processes story and narrative and emotional experiences through creating music. But I think I learned at some point that life is seasonal, that our experiences are seasonal, and our experience of the world is not a single platform trajectory. And it's intriguing because that's counter to how we train, right? We do hours and hours of training. And I'm sure you both are in that same boat as kids. You probably spent hours, you came home from school, you spent hours at your craft So you have this trajectory that you're creating, and academia just flames that. It just flames or fans those flames, I should say, right? Because you're shooting for that goal, whatever that goal is. You can never be good enough. You can never do enough. You can never, and of course our Western culture is kind of that way anyhow, right? You're always shooting for this trajectory. And I think at some point I realized that it was not really the core of how I wanted to define myself as a musician. I knew I would always be a composer, but I also, as Mary Oliver talks about, I wanted to think about what I wanted to do with my one wild and precious life. She has that glorious phrase, that poem, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? And I couldn't imagine myself on the treadmill, the hamster wheel of a career that would always demand so much from me that it would suck my life out. Now, I don't mean that to sound grim at all. It's just that you really can't do everything. You can try your best and it'll burn you out. I think that began to hit me in the years of working with, I was writing music scores for PBS, and I would go in with a score that I'd worked so hard on for a week, for 3 minutes of music, right? This is back in the late 90s. So it was a little more primitive as far as the synthesizers and the kind of computer technology we had back then.
Yeah.
But I'd spend hours working on these 3 minutes. And the producer would say, oh, can you make it sound a little more like, and they'd play me a little something. And I would think, oh my gosh, I just spent 48 hours on 3 minutes. And this person could care less. They want something with a backbeat, or they want something with a different instrument. So I tried to be realistic about my calling and my love and my passion for writing music, and also my passion and love for experiencing life. And I've been lucky enough to partner up with a wonderful spouse who celebrates and loves learning and wants to sort of squeeze the most out of life as well. And I think that brought us to this wonderful experience of having kids. And perhaps, I mean, in many ways, I think having a child is very much like a composition process. Except you're working with DNA instead of notes. It's just the kind of bringing something into the world that has a life of its own is very much like the process of music. It's intriguing. Throughout my cycles of experience, once I kind of got out of that hamster wheel and began to just think in terms of, okay, this is a season in my life. What can I learn? How can I bring myself as a composer to this season of life? That sort of freed me to really savor and enjoy and learn from where I was in the moment. I ended up in a position where I went from working in recording studios and creating music scenarios for visual to working as a music director, where I was writing for ensembles and working with human beings. I think that helped a little bit as well, because it made me realize that so much of what we do is community based. It's engaging with other people, and it's engaging in their skills and abilities, and it's using music as a way of empowering community. So that was one of those seasons of my life where I learned so much that I bring now to this season of my life, where my kids are out of the house, they're thriving, and I'm able to say, okay, what I had those previous seasons, how can they inform where I am now in my life? And I'm lucky, because it just so happens that in this season of life, it is much more friendly to female composers. I mean, that has happened even in the last 5 years. I think COVID opened so many doors, because a lot of musicians or a lot of groups were willing to take risks online that they maybe wouldn't have taken in a live performance, where they were having to pay for a building or a whole production. I met a ton of people who are willing to say, oh yeah, let's try this on. And again, it's that wonderful opportunity of the season. well, I wouldn't say wonderful. COVID was obviously awful, but it was a season that allowed us to learn new tools. I'm guessing you all probably got into Zoom teaching and doing a lot of things online that maybe you wouldn't have normally.
It was definitely an interesting time.
That's a long answer.
It works. It works. I kind of wanted to tag on to that. Anytime somebody talks about balancing two separate aspects of their life, I'm immediately fascinated as somebody who struggles to toggle between creative work and the other stuff that, takes up my day. How do you balance the two?
I try to be really clear with what are the best times of day for my focus. So I'm pretty disciplined with my writing, and I know when I'm most alert and attentive, and I try to maximize my creative foment at that time. I spend a lot of time outdoors. I'm Norwegian, and so I have that sort of idea of being outside and engaging in gardening or tromping around with my rake or whatever. I'm super active that way. And I do think that contrast provides me with a break that is energizing for the kind of focus that I need for composing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, we're learning that with things like forest bathing and the idea that you need that light exposure, you need that exposure to green, whether it's indoor plants or outdoor plants. We need that exposure to be emotionally healthy. And I think music is so intense and so focused. And honestly, when you're in the flow of working on a project, you lose all sense of time and space. And the other thing I do, I force myself to stand. I work from a standing desk. And so I think it makes me aware of a physical need for breaks. But again, I do think that most of this is just being attentive to what it means to be at my peak in terms of focus. I happen to be a night person, so mornings mornings are when I try to get rid of do things that don't matter too much, and I'm realistic about that.
You were also talking about being a woman in this business. You've been honored at a number of festivals and competitions specifically designed to celebrate women composers. What are your thoughts on separating out gender in this way, which seems to be so very in fashion right now?
It does. I mean, as I mentioned before, if you think about the structures that allow for the kind of networking and support you need, if women were 100 years ago not able to perform because it was considered inappropriate, of course, Clara Schumann she's an outlier there, but then she was mostly performing her husband's work. So, she had a different focus. I think we still need to be intentional about the structures for women, just because it's difficult to network as long as you still have 90% of your orchestras playing music by white males. That leaves maybe 10% for women. And interestingly, we just Seattle just hired Cheyenne Zhang, I think her name is, female conductor. She's going to be one of the few conductors who's at the head of a renowned orchestra. Until we have sort of representation of half our population in positions of mobility and power and decision making, we won't have really the advocacy for women's voices to be heard. So I do think we need to be intentional about it, mostly for networking's sake, mostly because, even when I'm reading on forums online, it's intriguing to me that most of the responses that I see are from the guys. Though an issue will come up and all the guys will just jump on it. And I very rarely see women promoting their voices in relation to that. And I do think my experience with a lot of women is a bonding one. It's like, oh, I do this. And the response is, oh, I do too. Oh, isn't that exciting? And there's kind of a mutuality that's really healthy. Whereas oftentimes and this is no offense to the males, but oftentimes the male response is, well, I can do it better. That competition certainly drives a lot of the hierarchical thinking of Western competitiveness. If you read any of Jared Diamond, sort of that idea of self-selecting and promoting is certainly rewarded in our culture. It's part of celebrity culture too. But what it does is it doesn't create advocacy for each other. And I think it's much more fun as musicians when you can be each other's advocates, when you come alongside and you say, let's do something together. It's not about me outdoing you. Unfortunately, we have a commercial system that does not, we really don't support the arts in our culture, the classical arts, that is. And everything I'm saying is in relation to classical music, traditional classic music as defined in the Western tradition, because certainly this doesn't apply in pop music. You can see with Taylor Swift and Beyonce that women are just, soaring to the top of when the opportunities are provided. But I don't think those structures have existed in the traditional classical music structure. And part of that too is that classical music has historically looked to the past. If the past is defined by Western male composers, then that's what you project to the future if that's been successful in the past. People don't want to take the risk necessarily to branch out. So that's a long answer to say I think we need that communal element. And I think it's really exciting to meet other women. And when I was growing up, I didn't know any other female composers. There's a camaraderie and a joy in being together and encouraging one another. I think that brings out the healthiest part of people too.
Speaking of encouraging people, you recently won FNMC's composition competition with your piece, Cabinet of Curiosities. And we were hoping you would tell our listeners a little bit about it and maybe some of your inspirations for that duo.
Oh, you bet. Isn't that fun? I was so honored and so excited. And this has sort of been my year of flute music. It's been just a really fun time of exploration. I wrote this piece originally with a friend of mine in mind, flute player named Rose Johnson. And she was thinking about, the opportunities as a flute duo, how you can pick up your piccolo or your alto flute, and providing sort of a construct of many different evocative feelings or scenarios where they could kind of move through the different color combinations of these duets. I mean, two flutes by themselves are wonderful, but it's kind of exciting to throw in flute and alto or alto and piccolo or whatever to have those colors, because you have them certainly available to them often. So Cabinet of Curiosities is built on this whole idea of what was historically called a Wunderkammer, a cabinet of wonders. It actually came out of the tradition of the nobility, where they would have rooms filled with all these marvels. This is in the era where you would have, maybe you would have a fossil, or you would have gemstones, or you would have all these various things that would kind of wow your guests. And that started out in the nobility. And then in the mid 19th century, it became sort of the Victorian gentleman concept. The gentlemen would have their cabinets of curiosities, and they would invite you in, and you might see glass jars filled with strange things that they had collected. There was sort of that whole gentleman scientist scholarship. I don't say just gentlemen, because there were women doing it too. A lot of the women were doing the early work on finding fossils and such. And you would walk into this room, and there'd be all these odd bits and bobs that defined, who you were. Perhaps not defined who you were as a person, but they reflected your interests and your sense of curiosity and your sense of wonder. So I wanted to create that feeling, that sense of walking into or opening up a cabinet and seeing all these odd, strange things. I still think we kind of do that as people. I mean, whether it's your Instagram account or your top shelf in your bedroom or whatever, we all collect these little odd items that mean something to us. Some of them may be more personal than others. And in this particular piece, I wanted you to feel like you're walking in and you're kind of working your way through mystery. And I wanted to feel a little bit kind of maybe a little scary or a little sinister and then a little fun and playful, so that even the names are quite evocative. Things like nothing is defined. I wanted you to experience each piece in your own mind. So the titles are purposefully vague. Things like they belong to her grandmother. That's one movement. It stares back at you. That's another movement. Once they had wings is another movement. Shaped by the sea, you can still feel the sun from deep in karst caves. So each of these is kind of an evocative image, and you know, Elizabeth or Nicole will have a different response in your brain than I will, as that when if I say it belonged to her grandmother, you're going to have that image of something nostalgic. I love that idea of playing with people's buy-in as they go through that evocative experience. Interestingly enough, my husband is a brain scientist, so I get a lot of brain science just by osmosis. And that whole process of imagining in your brain when you listen to something is called virtual transposition. And it's also what we do when we're reading. You know how you see a scene and you see the characters in your brain? Virtual transposition, he considers to be sort of miracle grow for the brain. It's one of the healthiest, most dynamic things you can do for an active brain. So it's why it's so important for kids to read, not just watch movies, which gives you the visual imagery, but read. And I think it's why it's so important in music that we engage our listeners, because you are investing in their imagination and you're working together. Then it's not just about you promoting something. You're actually reaching out to an audience member saying, listen to this with me. What do you see?
I have a very practical kind of prosaic question for you as a future performer of Cabinet of Curiosities. Different composers feel differently about how you program their works. What are your thoughts on somebody picking up this score and choosing to perform some but not all of the movements based on what instruments they have available to them, for instance?
I think that's great. It's written as individual objects, just as you might open up a cabinet and take something out. You may not want to drag someone through 7 different objects. You might want to say, hey, look at this. Isn't this interesting? It's intentionally multi-movement, because I do think we also need to think in terms of very practical time constraints anytime you're programming music. And especially now as sort of attention spans shrink, we need to keep people engaged. But one interesting thing that's happened with this idea of Cabinet of Curiosities, I was just reading in the paper a couple of days ago, they were talking about how scientists, archaeologists are having a hard time getting dinosaur fossils because really wealthy billionaires, tech bros, are sort of buying them all up and using them as they're in their own homes. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're returning to the source. This whole concept came out of the Wunderkammer. And now that we have all this, this amazing disposable income, people are actually doing this. They're continuing to do this in their home. And it's returning to that whole idea of the privileged purchasing these amazing objects.
I feel like you're describing me when I was like 8 and 9. Like I was a little Victorian man.
Did you collect all those things?
Yeah, I did. I had this, it was this weird box. It looks like a coffin or something. I don't know where it came from. It had this very, fancy overlay that made it look like Petoskey stone. My dad had it and he gave it to me. And I would just collect little things, and just keep them in my box. None of my friends ever wanted to see my collection, but now I realize I was just talking to the wrong crowd. I needed to talk to like a nobleman from the 19th century.
Yeah, exactly. And all of it is tied to your essential core of curiosity. That sort of sense of wonder that you have as a little kid that I think sometimes gets squeezed out of you as an adult because you begin to only see it, the practical side of things. Well, do I really need this box full of rocks. Whereas a child, through a child's perspective, they're magic rocks, right? There's a sense of awe and potentiality. We need more of that.
Kind of in this vein, as we were prepping for the interview, I was looking through a lot of your recent catalog and noticed that so much of it was based in story. The Selkies piece that you just had performed at NFA and the Dog Diaries in particular stick out in my memory. How do you choose where your inspirations come from?
I love narrative. I love stories. I love folklore. To me, all of that is the magic and wonder of human experience over time. And I think the narrative is really important. I know that, music serves multiple purposes. It has religious significance, it has dance significance, it has mating ritual significance, it has all these different functions. For me, though, I've always been drawn to this idea of what I would say historically is the idea of the bard. You're telling the history, you're telling the narrative, you're telling this story. I just am drawn to that. It's that little girl in me that loved fairy tales, that, disappeared under my covers with my flashlight and read Grimm's fairy tales and imagined, the scenarios. That still lives so strongly. I love reading fantasy. I'm still there. I'm a big little kid. So I love to see that in the music. And I do think we are in a generation where narrative is so strong in our culture. You look at what people are binging and the quality of the kind of narrative that was coming out. It's pretty astounding if you look at both digital content and the books and the stories. And we are obsessed as a culture with telling stories. And part of that is, I think it's just one of the most primal parts of our brain. Our brain is designed for narrative. If you pick up a vegetable and see two little dots, your brain will go, oh, look, it looks like eyes. It's a face, right? There's something deep in your brain that says, oh, I recognize that. Or one of the things my husband always says is people perceive meaning before detail.
Mm.
If something has meaning to you, you will consider the details. And where I see that in narrative, there's an old story about just language in terms of this idea of narrative. Okay, so the details are the king died and the queen died. You can add two words and those details become a narrative. You say the king died and then the queen died of grief. Suddenly that goes from being just information to a narrative, a story. So I feel like our brain is already prepped for that. And part of the joy in music, for me at least, is creating those narratives that you can enter into. It's like a playful dance between where my brain wants to go and where an audience is listening or a player wants to explore. I'm just a big kid. I like stories. I like emotions. I like working through ideas and painting pictures in people's minds.
What, Kari, do you think is one of the biggest challenges you're facing in your work right now?
I think not paying attention to the news. I think one of the great challenges we have,
Ouch.
I mean, I love the digital medium. I love the fact that I have an orchestra at my fingertips, and the technology allows me such freedom and flexibility and speed and printing out all my parts. I mean, it's awesome. It's amazing. But I have to know where to close out what comes in, because we are not designed to be aware 24/7 of all the crises of the world around us. If we can't do anything about it, it puts us in a constant state of stress and anxiety. It's one of the reasons why I think this generation of kids coming up is seeing so much anxiety and stress, that they are being bombarded with an awareness that I never had as a kid. I was out in nature, and my day was defined by when the sun went down and when it came up and what my watch said. So this idea of an awareness, and granted, I will say it is fantastic to have the connection around the world and to be aware of our planet and to be responsible towards our planet and how we live on it and live with it and live with other people. But we are also aware of all the crises. These crises have always existed. We've always had so much despair around the planet, but we are now aware of it 24/7. And I think artists tend to hold this heavily as a mantle. I think that we feel intensely about life and living with other people. We care about people. Our artists are often very empathetic. And so I think the weight of that can feel oppressive. At times you can begin to think, what is the purpose of me putting this little motif on the staff here for this flute player when I know that people are starving, or I know that people are at war. So that, I guess, that awareness that it doesn't destroy your desire to create and bring goodness into the world and bring hope into the world.
This conversation is very therapeutic. I should Venmo you some money. This is exactly what I need right now.
I'm such an advocate for hope and beauty and wonder, and I mean that's where my heart is. But I know you feel it, don't
Yeah.
you? You feel it, and you think, how can I, when I pick up this instrument, how can I make a difference? And we have to encourage that in one another. It's one of the reasons why I love working with real musicians and not just a computer, is that it's about encouraging that gift and that hope and that vision in what you can do and what we can do together. I think that's really important, that web of community and encouragement.
We usually like to ask our guests to name three pieces that they're listening to because it's such a fun way to collect new art, new ideas to explore. But you specifically mentioned your love of poetry on your website. And so I'm interested to explore that avenue instead. Could you list three poets you can't live without?
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's hard to it's hard to pare it down. I do love poetry because I think it's very much like composition. It takes you, it's a unique moment in time. It calls you into its presence. It's so, it makes you, you have to be present to the poem. You have to enter into it for it to have meaning. You can't just read it as you would prose. I think you can create some distance with prose. So my top is, of course, Emily Dickinson. I adore Emily Dickinson. She was outside of time and space in terms of her role as a Victorian woman. It's interesting because she, to me, represents how women coped as artists called to their craft. Christina Rossetti was the same way. The only way they could maintain their art form and their calling was to stay single and childless and create an environment within the home where they could be true to their craft. And I have so much respect for that. The strength of character that it would have taken in a time period where women were judged by their fecundity and were treated as property. You were either the property of your spouse or your father. And the idea that you could step out of that and speak with the kind of timeless wisdom and curiosity that she does. So I try to live by Emily's idea of dwelling in possibilities. I love that. I dwell in possibilities, and the more I learn about her and read her poems, of course she's got thousands and thousands of poems. I love the idea that she wrote in complete and quiet, not captivity, but in her own space, that she didn't write for posterity. She was writing because she was called as an artist to write. She never had an intention to publish. All of her stuff was hidden away, and she asked her sister to burn it, right? We only have her voice because someone said, no, this needs to be heard. But the art just existed in its own beautiful bubble. So Emily would be up there. I love the accessibility of Mary Oliver. I love her invitation to beauty and joy and being alive in the moment. that her call to what are you going to do with this one wild and precious life. She just has an immediacy that I adore. I love Maya Angelou. I love Robert Frost. I love Shakespeare. I love the Psalms. I love Rumi. I love T.S. Eliot. I mean, I kind of go everywhere, and I try to look at modern poets and kind of marry them with historic poets. I'm drawn to the historic poets in terms of setting text just because of the copyright laws. so as a, when I'm setting art song, I am very conscious of, okay, is this a text that I can use, or can I not use it? So there is that element too. But I do think Emily, I put her at the top. She has a voice that transcends time.
It's funny. I was thinking as you were talking, something that classical music often has in common with poetry is that I think a lot of people feel intimidated, like they aren't educated enough to know how to enjoy it. I think this is certainly a problem with classical music, that people feel like, oh, I don't know enough about classical, so I don't know what to do with all these sounds that go on for so long. And I think a lot of people feel this way about poetry too. Do you have any suggestions for listeners who don't feel so confident reading poetry, but would like to get started really making meaning of good poetry?
Oh yeah, because some of it really can be very cryptic. And I do think, like classical music, there was a time period when it was almost intentionally cryptic. You see that tremendous, there's a lot of academic poetry that's designed to titillate your fellow academics without any regard for the audience. It's more about playing with your friends, and impressing your friends. I mean, that can be fun too. It's like doing Sudoku or something. You're doing an academic exercise. So you're using your brain and you're using your expertise. But I think, oh gosh, I think Mary Oliver is a great way to start. I think Billy Collins, oh my gosh, Billy Collins is hysterical. If you have a chance to hear him reading his own poems, you can get him on YouTube. He's a great way to start. He's got a real sort of monotone delivery, but his sense of irony and his lack of pompousness or arrogance, he has that kind of delight in what he's doing without a need to prove himself. And I mean, a lot of contemporary poets, I think, carry that kind of genuineness. I think we're seeing more of people bringing their own poetry and reading it online. I think even going in with a mindset of, I'm just going to experience this and listen to it too. A lot of it is designed to be heard. So not just reading it, but hearing the language as you would listen to music, and just allowing your mind to savor and enjoy, not necessarily try to figure it out, just allow it to wash over you. Mary Oliver is great that way because she's I would say invitational.
That's a great idea. Listening.
Yeah. And listening with delight and intention. Not, I mean, you guys know this in relation to music, that there is music that is background, that you can sort of have in the background, that does not invite engagement necessarily. It's sort of designed to sort of create a mood. Poetry is not that way. Poetry does invite, much in the way that I think chamber music does too. Don't you think that when you're playing chamber music, don't you feel like there's an intensity that perhaps is less anonymous than, say, a large ensemble?
I have to be, and this is something I love about chamber music, I have to be much more engaged than when I'm playing in an orchestra. You're kind of not rewarded for being engaged past a certain point in an orchestra, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But you and your teammates are all driving the bus together in chamber music.
Yeah, I think the audience experiences that. So when an orchestra is mediated by a conductor, and so the relationship is different, the orchestra becomes a kind of unit in and of itself. But when people experience chamber music, they're looking at the different players in a more experiential way. It's one of the reasons why I think we need chamber music to communicate to kids, because it introduces their experience of an instrument and the instrumental color and the instrumental sound. And there is no mediator. There's not a conductor standing in the way. They're watching there's an intimacy in watching those people play. I would love your perspective on that.
Yeah, I'm curious what you think, Elizabeth, because you do a whole lot more orchestral playing than I do, but you also do a ton of chamber music. What are your
Well, I think in
your
the
experience with
orchestral world, my brain has been hopelessly rewired by being the auxiliary piccolo player, and
that?
I do not feel I can behave differently because there are so many, like I'm not in charge of making as many decisions, but there are more things to react to. And
Mm,
so
mm.
while the stressors are different, I feel the same amount of engagement. Maybe it's just I guess in chamber music I feel more free to make choices, where in an orchestral setting, as lovely as my conductor is, many of the decisions are being dictated to me by him or by the principal flutist. And then in chamber music, there are fewer things to pay attention to because you have fewer partners and fewer other instruments that you're tuning to. And for me, more often than not, they're more homogenous, same family instruments. But the trade-off is you're responsible for more of the musical decisions and more of the leading of the ensemble. And so for me, I mean, maybe that's what the kids react to better than, is that I as a person might be more visible in the artistic choices that I'm making in a chamber music setting, where in an orchestra, who I am as a person kind of gets subsumed, but my brain is very much working hard because I got to tune to a cello and a bass and a tuba and a violin too and a flute too and a just everywhere.
Yeah, it's a wall of sound.
Well, Kari, this has been such a sell for me, this conversation, and also so much food for thought.
Hmm.
Very
Well,
stimulating.
it's
Thank you for
so
joining us.
it's so wonderful to talk with you both. I've enjoyed it so much, and thank you for inviting me to share.
Well, and thanks for sharing your piece with all of FNMC. I'm really excited to get to know it better this year.
Same.
Great. I look forward to hearing it played. Let me know if you play it.
Absolutely.
And anyone
Thank
else
you.
who's listening out there, let us know if you play it on the form. Please.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.